Today we have the final lecture on our Bitcoin cryptocurrency series, and we are fortunate to have two speakers from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, Julie Stackhouse and David Andolfatto. I'm going to give a brief introduction of Julie, and she's going to introduce David. Julie Stackhouse is an Executive Vice President and Managing Officer of Supervision, Credit, Community Development, and Learning Innovation for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Prior to joining the St. Louis Fed in September 2002, she served as Vice President and Managing Officer of Risk Management Department of the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. In addition, she was formerly an officer with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Ms. Stackhouse holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Drake University and is a graduate of Wisconsin Graduate School of Banking. In 2010, she was named St. Louis Business Journal Most Influential Businesswoman and recipient of that award, and in 2016 was awarded the Delta Sigma Pi Lifetime Achievement Award. So Julie, thank you for coming.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do tonight is I'm just going to do a little spiel here and introduce Dave Andolfatto, who is an economist. I'm a finance person, and I also want to let you know that new bank examiners earn north of $50,000 a year when they start too. So for finance and accounting majors, there's my little spiel. Dave's going to walk through some slides with you, and then we're going to do the most important part. We're going to open this up to your questions. So Dave and I have had a chance to practice this in St. Louis. We did a very similar session for a packed house in St. Louis. And I think it worked out pretty well. As a true economist, David will walk through the economics of what you're going to see here today. And then as a true business person, I'll probably question him a little bit in some of his thinking. And I think that will give you a rich sense of the fact that what is probably right from an economic standpoint may or may not play out from a business standpoint. And certainly I hope that gives you something to talk about. So before we start, I know there's a lot of students here. How many of you have purchased Bitcoin? One, two, then there's the ones, I'm not going to raise my hand. All right, so how'd it work out?
Pretty well. I made a little bit of money.
You made a little money, okay. And back there, how'd it work out?
I just did it like 3 days ago.
Oh, you'll probably lose money, don't worry. So the story that I always tell is I have two children. They're classic millennials, a little older than you, and I have a son who is just very savvy about online anything. And he does, some of the online gambling, you know, we say you have to watch that, be careful. It's not, yeah, you do it too, I see that. And one day he came, and he's married now, and he said, well, been watching Bitcoin, and I think I'll probably just buy some Bitcoin. I'm the finance person. I said, do you understand that that product is not insured? There's no federal deposit insurance. Do you understand that you could lose every cent that you put into that product? He said, I do. He said, I've studied it, Mom. I have some house money. You all get this. You know, I'm like, okay. And so he went, this is a couple years ago, he bought some Bitcoin. Guess what? What do you think happened?
How many years ago?
Oh, about 2.
Probably lost it.
No, he actually made a ton of money. He got in before it went down. Dang it, for all the adults in the room, that is not the life lesson you want to teach your child. So anyway, I do think it's a great story because there is a lot here to think about, and you're going to learn a lot about it tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce David. And I'm a little too close to the speakers, so I'm going to move away so it doesn't squeal for you. David is a colleague of mine who I really appreciate at the Federal Reserve, even though he is an economist. He is a senior vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. He earned his bachelor's degree at Simon Fraser University and then his Master of Arts in Economics at Simon Fraser. After that, he earned his PhD in economics at the University of Western Ontario. His areas of interest include dynamic general equilibrium theory, this is a business person, macroeconomics, labor markets, and monetary theory. He has just an incredible number of publications, including several that are in the works. and is truly an asset to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So please join me in welcoming David.
Do I have the clicker? Oh, here it is. Yeah. Thank you very much, Julie, for that wonderful introduction. Let me just say what a pleasure it is for me to be here today to speak to you on a subject that's been near and dear to my heart for the last few years. The subject of my talk today is blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currency. And like Julie said, I'm an economist. And as an economist, I like to take a bird's eye view, kind of a broad view of what's going on. Julie, I find Julie a very valuable colleague as well because she comes and chides me and disciplines me. She's more familiar with the plumbing underneath that we often as economists abstract from or gloss over. But I think there's value to taking a bird's eye view just to see the broad perspective. And then later on we'll have a Q&A and Julie will challenge me on some of my claims. So blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currency. Hey, what do these things have in common? After reflecting on this question, I was talking to my wife about this, and I said, you know what, I'm going to give a lecture on accounting. And she put her hand on my shoulder and says, darling, that is just not sexy at all. Can you try to sell it some other way? But in fact, no, I think it's actually very, very important to understand that what this is all about is record keeping, or just keeping track of information, or database management more generally. It might not be sexy, but it's tremendously important. And in terms of data, what type of data are we talking about here? We're not talking about information, say, at the level of, say, the recipe for chicken soup or a blueprint for a wonderful building. What we're talking about here is a particular type of information management. Information, in this context, relates to personal performance histories. Things like credit histories, or customer service records, or educational attainment, or just as simple as, what have you done in life to contribute to the community? What is your record of achievement? Are you a person who's drawn more from the community that's contributed? Have you paid your taxes? All of these things. This is a type of information that is, in fact, what economists call intrinsically useless information. What do I mean by intrinsically useless? Suppose you were stranded on a deserted island. It'd be very difficult to subsist off of your credit history, right? It's just information. It has no substance. It's just information. So it's intrinsically useless in that sense. And yet, if you think about it, in a social context, this type of information becomes tremendously valuable. Firms will pay to acquire your credit history, for example. Why is that? Why is it that this type of information relating to your performance record is so valuable? It's because it's the stuff that our reputations are built on. A firm's reputation, your personal reputation. I'd go so far as this is almost defines who we are. Who we are is what we've done in life, our net contributions to society. And people who have made contributions to their community often achieve high standing, high status, high credit. It's very easy to go a person in good standing in the community. If the person needs a favor done, oftentimes members of the community will bend over backwards to help you out, right? If you belong to a network of friends and you're known to help your friends out when they're in need, you know that you can basically use this good credit as currency. Anytime you need a favor, you can go and spend your credit in that manner. So that's the sense in which this type of information constitutes a form of currency. And as currency, it suffers from all of the problems that currency suffers from. There's a big incentive to steal it, to counterfeit it, or to otherwise fabricate it, okay? So, say a company that wants to attract a new client tries to misrepresent itself as a company that has a very good customer service record and tries to get a new client that way, all right? Or perhaps the company is pretending, or an individual might engage in an act of identity theft, which is essentially stealing somebody else's good reputation for a private benefit at the expense of the community. Now, we see this all the time in society. People or businesses misrepresenting themselves, misrepresenting their performance records essentially, portraying themselves as somebody who's good in some sense, with good credit history, good reputations, when in fact they're bad. This is tantamount to stealing money or counterfeiting money. And this is very, very problematic because this reputational mechanism is something that serves a very vital economic function in societies, right? It's the stuff, we basically rely on reputational mechanisms to support all sorts of financial transactions. You know, so for example, why is it that we believe that our bank won't steal our money? Well, we like to think that these bankers are angels, but maybe not all of them are, but even if they weren't, they should be concerned about preserving their reputation of their bank, which has, you know, otherwise they might risk losing the franchise value of the bank. So these reputational mechanisms, at least in economic theory, and I think in reality, do tend to support exchanges that might not otherwise occur. If people could costlessly fabricate reputations, steal them or counterfeit them, it's the same thing as just, what if people could just print money or counterfeit money? Well, if that was the case, why do you ever want to go to work for money? Everybody would just print it, and of course, in what would happen is the value of the money would fall to zero. And all the social good that comes from monetary exchange, all the intertemporal exchanges that are supported by monetary exchange would collapse as well. So this is a very, very important question, an important problem. The key question is this, at a very broad level. Consider a community, and feel free to pick whatever community you want. Your family, your friends, people at work, your community here in Louisville, perhaps in the country, in a particular business sector. You define community, and the question is how are members of a given community wanting to share and manage a database of performance records, how are they to do so when they do not fully trust each other in regards to the management and recording of this data? Because there's always this little incentive to kind of, shirk or free ride by counterfeiting this data for your own personal benefit at the expense of the community. So that's the fundamental problem. Now, in any database management system, there are going to be at least two key parameters that have to be determined, among others. But here are two key ones. First, the database management system is going to have to specify who has the read privilege. Who gets to read what's in the database? Are we going to make it open? Are we going to say this database, anybody who wants to go see it can go read it? Or do we want to make it closed, permissioned? Do we only want to grant access to this database to a select few? So that's a question. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just where do we want to set the parameter? A more important parameter is the write permission. Who gets to write to the database? Because if this database is indeed currency, the right to write, that's R-I-G-H-T to W-R-I-T-E, the right to write to the database is tantamount to the right to print money. So you can ask the question, who should be given the right to print money? Who do we trust? Should be a delegated third party that we can trust somehow? Or in other words, should we make the right permission closed, or should we make the right permission open? Should we open it up so that the community as a whole is responsible for, say, controlling the money supply, if you like, in this case. In terms of a diagram, we can think about plotting these parameters in this two-dimensional space. On the y-axis, I plot the read privilege that ranges from open to closed. So if you want more decentralized to centralized, if you want. And on the x-axis, I can similarly write down the write privilege as a parameter ranging from more or less open. Open would be decentralized, and closed would be a centralized system. And then I can fill in these quadrants with examples to give you examples of what I mean here. So an example of a database management system where the read privilege is open, but the write privilege is closed. Maybe you can come up with examples. I mean, the one that comes to my mind right away is a public library. Okay? A public library, the database is open. It's public. You can go, and anybody is free to look over the books and to read the database, the information that's contained in these volumes. But not everybody's allowed to write to the public library. It's the librarians who are trusted to be in charge of accepting which books are to be placed in the stacks. Okay? So that's an example of an open read but closed write privilege. What about down here? What's an example of a database management system where both the read and write privilege are closed or centralized? The classic example is that of your bank. Okay, so a bank manages a database, accounts. We all have accounts at our banks. I don't know what's in your bank account. You don't know what's in my bank account. It's closed to us. The bank manager knows what's in our bank accounts. That authority has been delegated. Okay. And the write privilege has similarly been delegated to the bank, our banker. We trust the banker to make the appropriate debit and credit operations on this balance sheet, on this ledger. We can't do it ourselves. Here's a tricky one, but I did come up with an example. An example where the write privilege is open, but the read privilege is closed. So I had to think about this one. And what I came up with was physical cash. So what do I mean by that? I don't know, does anybody still use cash? I always check my pockets to see if I have any. I never have any. Whoops, I've already revealed what's in my pockets. What do we know about cash? We know that everybody in this room probably has some, possibly zero. Cash is distributed in our pockets or our wallets or accounts, I don't care what you call it. We know that there's a distribution of cash holdings in this room. It's like a ledger. This is your account. This is how much cash you have in your pocket. You know how much cash you have in your pocket. But the ledger is basically invisible to all of us. So it's closed. I cannot see what is encoded. This information, which is like how much money each of us has in our pocket, is invisible to all of us. So it's closed. Who gets to write to the ledger? Well, actually, all of us. The ledger transactions here are going to take the form of peer-to-peer transactions of cash, usually in exchange for services. Right? So how do we do the debiting and crediting in this room on a cash basis? Do we need a bank to help us do the debiting and crediting of the wallets in our pockets? No, we do it by ourselves. And everybody's free to do that. So everybody in the community takes part in the debiting and crediting of accounts through peer-to-peer transactions involving transfers of cash from one pocket to another pocket. It's just like debiting and crediting accounts in your bank account, except that we actually do it without the aid of a trusted intermediary. And then we have the top right example of where the read and write privilege are open, both open. And what do we have there? Well, here we have the cryptocurrencies, okay? Cryptocurrencies are where the database is open. The database in this case often is labeled a blockchain. A blockchain is just a particular database of transactions, of monetary, actually to be specific. It's a record of money flows from wallet to wallet. all over time. So it's a kind of a transaction history in that sense. The other side of the transaction isn't recorded on the blockchain. It's not like the goods that are purchased or the services that are purchased are not on the blockchain, just the transfers of money from account to account are. And so this is openly visible. It's an open database. And also, the write privilege is open as well. So anybody, for example, with Bitcoin is free to partake in the activity of updating and writing to the ledger. And that's what the miners are for. Anybody's free to become a miner, assuming that you're willing to bear the expense of the electricity and the hardware that's involved in the activity. But you don't have to go to school to get a Bitcoin mining license. Everybody's free to partake in the activity. And it's more of a communal rather than delegated record-keeping system. What's another? Does anybody have an example of another type of database management system that's open, that both the read and write privilege is open? I just came up with one this morning. Wikipedia, exactly. I said Wikipedia actually fits into that box as well. I also put up there social credit systems. Like, what the heck is that? A social credit system? I mean, I know I'm at the Center for Free Enterprise here. Social credit systems are essentially, well, let me go to the next slide. I think open read write databases. Until recently, only the most primitive economies have employed database management systems with open read and write privileges. It's kind of amazing if you think about it this way. So if you think about a social credit system, the way anthropologists have discovered in say, hunter-gatherer societies, one thing anthropologists have noted that I think they have an up on economists is when they go to study these hunter-gatherer societies, they notice something. They notice the distinct lack of an object that any one of us might identify as money. Sometimes trinkets are exchanged in ceremonial rites, or sometimes it's some sort of object that's exchanged across tribes. But if you take a look at the activity of a small hunter-gatherer group, 50 families or so, there's no money in these societies. They don't use money. They are really just communal, kind of reciprocal gift exchange sort of societies that work I argue, on a database that is an open virtual ledger updated by a communal consensus algorithm. I don't think any anthropologist is going to say that, but it's a very, very simple idea. I know this too because my mother, who grew up in a very small, kind of primitive economy, World War II Italian village, kind of describes to me the situation in these small communities. There's situations where basically everybody knows everything about everyone. And if you think about it, why do you need money in a society where everyone knows everything about everyone? It's pretty clear what you have to do in this community to survive and prosper. If you're a good hunter, you go out and hunt. I mean, that's it. You bring back the kill, the elders distribute it, and you ask, geez, I mean, well, doesn't this person get paid? Why do they do this if they don't get paid in money? What do you need money for? Of course they get paid. What do you think they get paid in? If you're a star hunter, you get treated like a rock star in these communities. You can get anything you want. You don't need money. All you need is that the community recognizes your personal action history. You are a net contributor to the crowd, to the community, and you can expect to be compensated. You don't need money for that. And it's true today too, isn't it? I play soccer every Sunday with my buddies. Believe me, it's getting more and more difficult. But we have, after the game, we often go for a beer. And, I buy the first round usually because I'm the oldest. And then my friend Mark buys a round, and then so on and so forth. But there's this one friend, Bill. He always skips out. He's always in the bathroom, and it's his turn to. He thinks we don't see this, but of course, this is a communal record keeping. Everybody can see everything, right? And the consensus very, very rapidly develops. I mean, Bill is like not contributing to the community. Now, if Bill keeps this up, what happens? What happens in a community where you don't pull your weight? Oftentimes, a type of punishment that is invoked is just ostracism from the community. In hunter-gatherer societies, ostracism was tantamount to a death sentence. In my soccer team, it's a little less drastic, but the threat of being kicked out of your group is an important disciplinary device, right? It keeps the community geared on incentivizing people to make sure that they're net contributors to the community to the extent that they can. Money is not necessary. What is necessary is a communal database system. Everybody has to understand and observe on this virtual ledger. What do I mean by virtual? I mean there's no written records, it just exists in our heads. It's virtual, it's on a distributed database that exists in our heads. We don't have computer servers, we have our minds, and we communicate and update this ledger, the shared communal history, the shared history of the community, we update by just talking to each other or gossiping, something like that. Actually, this type of system works really well. In fact, we continue to use it every day in small groups. What's the problem with this type of primitive blockchain, as I call it? The problem is it doesn't scale very well. It works pretty well in kind of small communities, but it doesn't scale. At the level of a city, for example, our brains are just too small to keep track of what everybody is doing in a population of, say, 1 million people. It's just not possible. And that's why we developed the delegated record keepers, because delegated record keeping scales very nicely. But recently, owing to advances in electronic data storage, in electronic communications, kind of a cryptography that has enhanced security of communications and data storage, as well as innovations in game theory. Here's a pitch for you to kind of do some economics and some game theory that have been used to come up with clever consensus algorithms like proof of work in Bitcoin, if you're familiar. These types of advances together, I think Bitcoin was really the first to do this, was to combine these ideas all together and form the first electronic kind of blockchain. Like I said, the primitive version has always existed. Okay, blockchain. Sometimes, I've said blockchain and stuff like this, blockchain. Oftentimes, people bandy about a word and they don't stop to define it, which I think problematic, especially in this sphere. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to just demystify it a little bit for those who are a little bit confused about it still, and provide what I consider to be a precise definition. Because I think it's important to understand, to define the terms that we're talking about. I want you to think about a history textbook published in 2016 about events like personal action histories in a community that occurred in 2014 and 2015. And for the sake of argument, let's suppose it has to do with our community here in this. This textbook is about our lives. Imagine that we're living together on an island. And chapter 1 basically records what each of us have done over the course of the year. I went and I gave a lecture. You guys went and bought me some bourbon afterwards. Maybe. And it's all recorded. And so you have chapter 1, everything's recorded. Chapter 2, and we published this book in 2006. This book is available in 2016, and it's a history of our community here. Notice the structure. I mean, you can think of a chapter as, I could relabel a chapter as a block of information. It's a block. What type of information? Personal action history. So that's a block of information. Chapter 2 is a block of information. Actually, chapter 2 is these are timestamp blocks of information. This occurred in 2014, 2015, so they're timestamp blocks of information that are chained together in a blockchain of information. The information written in Chapter 2, we hope is consistent with what's written in Chapter 1. And then the next year, what goes right? The next year, new events are recorded in this ever-expanding chain of blocked information, and so on and so forth. This is an ever-expanding chain of blocked information. So we can actually think of history as time-stamped blocks of information, here, chapters, in a history textbook, and an ever-expanding history textbook that you can call blockchain. This is the type of basic structure that the blockchain, say, Bitcoin has. Now, it's a little more complicated than that because the data takes a particular structure. The data is transformed into a Merkle tree. I'm not going to tell you what a Merkle tree is because I don't have time. But you do have Google, and you can go and Google what a Merkle tree is. It's not that important. It's just a data transformation that basically chains the data together numerically in a logical sequence. What makes it kind of nice is that this type of chained structure of the information that logically links the data together in this way is very useful for security purposes, because suppose I don't like what's written here. This says that David didn't pay his taxes in 2017. Suppose I want to breach that database, kind of alter the record. It would be valuable for me to do so, right? Well, the Merkle tree structure means that for me to alter this record, I also have to go back and alter a corresponding record in order to make sure that the history is consistent with what I'm recording or fabricating here. And moreover, I have to do that all the way back to the beginning. I have to actually go back. I mean, if there are like thousands or millions of chapters, and remember in Bitcoin, a new chapter is added every 10 minutes. So there's going to be a lot of data revision to be done. And that's expensive. That's very computationally expensive. And at the same time, the history continues to grow every 10 minutes. It becomes very, very difficult for any one individual to alter the database for their own personal benefit. That's a really, really nice property of this blockchain, makes it very, very secure. Okay. So I define a blockchain as a database organized as a Merkle tree updated by a strategy-proof communal consensus protocol or game. You see, that's now you know I'm an economist. I mean, I use all that language. But I mean, that's technically what it is. If you really want to know what it is, learn what those terms mean. That's what I mean by a blockchain. The distinguishing characteristic of a blockchain is not so much this Merkle tree, it's this communal consensus protocol. That's, I think, the distinguishing property of a blockchain is that as opposed to the standard model of database management where we delegate a trusted third party, blockchain does the record keeping on more of a communal kind of basis, much the way primitive blockchains have done in the past. That's the distinguishing characteristic. And then you can ask the question, well, okay, now I kind of understand what blockchain is, the database management system that kind of runs off of a communal consensus protocol. What's it good for? In principle, it could be good for if the delegated record keeper is not trusted to manage your records. So recently we've had some high-profile data breaches, Yahoo and Equifax, for example. Maybe you just don't trust these entities to manage your personal information securely. Or maybe you just kind of philosophically are not, you're predisposed not to trust the central bank. You just don't trust central bankers. They're evil. Okay, I mean, fair enough, it's a free country. If you don't trust, then you need some alternative. What's the alternative way to manage the data? You might want to use a blockchain. Or maybe you do trust the third party, but they're too expensive. They're exploiting their monopoly position. This is Western Union, for example, in international remittances, charges an arm and a leg. It's not that I don't trust them, it's just that they're just really charging too much. And I might want to find a way to bypass them. Or perhaps the trusted third party is just not available. Imagine that you're a firm that belongs in a community of firms in a supply chain. You'd like to share your data with your community members, but there's no trusted third party to manage a database. What do? You might want to structure some sort of communal consensus-based record-keeping system. So blockchain might be good for that. What are some successful use cases of blockchain? I'll be frank with you, I don't know. But maybe in the Q&A, and maybe people will have some ideas, you can let me know, because one thing is true, that even if we don't have any successful use cases to date, it's still pretty early on in the program, and we shouldn't discount the possibility that something might happen in the future. But at the end of the day, I think it's just going to be very, very tough for blockchain solutions to compete with the conventional, reputable intermediary in terms of efficiency. If you want to compare like Bitcoin to Fedwire, I'll talk about Fedwire in a moment a bit more, but Fedwire is basically a real-time gross settlement system. It's a database management system operated by the Fed on behalf of the banks. It's a very, very efficient type of database management system. It processes over $3 trillion a day in payments, and it does so basically zero cost, especially relative to the volume transacted. If you compare it to Bitcoin, I mean, Bitcoin is nothing. I mean, and Bitcoin is much more expensive. It's inherently more expensive. You know, think back to the history textbook of our community. And imagine we delegated the responsibility to a trusted historian, as opposed to all of us gathering in this room at the end of the year and trying to hammer out what exactly happened over the last year. I mean, the consensus-based algorithm is always going to be more expensive. It may be an expense you're willing to bear, but it's going to be more expensive. Okay, cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies are just basically an application of the blockchain database management technology. It's the data of transactions is recorded on a distributed ledger called a blockchain. We know how that works. Payment requests are processed by these self-appointed miners. I mean, anybody can become a miner, and there's a particular algorithm or mechanism by which these payments are cleared, and there's some sort of consensus is reached. The data is added to the new chapter, and the chapters continue to grow in an ever-expanding sequence of blocks of information. The details of how that happens is kind of complicated. Like, I can't pretend to know exactly, you know, all the cryptography that's involved and all that, but the principle is pretty straightforward. At the end of the day, it's just an algorithm that's designed to get consensus in a rapid way with a large number of people belonging to the community. Should central bankers worry about these emergent cryptocurrencies? I argue not really. It kind of depends on which central bank you are, maybe. In the United States, no, I don't think so. But by and large, generally, central banks should just view these cryptocurrencies as just foreign currencies. That's basically what they are. They're foreign currencies that are operated by robots. But what's the difference? If a foreign currency is operated by North Korea or a robot, how we can't tell the difference? It's the same thing. And so, and in fact, it's much more transparent. The monetary policies are much more transparent in these cryptocurrencies. So this type of foreign currency competition is very familiar to central banks. I don't think it's anything necessarily to worry about, although I have written that potentially the existence of these currencies could potentially provide a useful check against what one might consider irresponsible monetary, possibly fiscal policy. So an interesting thought experiment it would be something like, consider the hyperinflation that's occurring in Venezuela today, and ask yourself, would that hyperinflation even have been possible if the Venezuelan population was, if they were, comfortable with using Bitcoin at the time the hyperinflation was starting to take off? That's kind of an interesting thought experiment. Because the availability of a substitute currency is, I mean, I guess that's nothing new in our history. We see that all the time in hyperinflations. People substitute into competing currencies, like they might go into gold or the US dollar, or things like that. So you might say, what's different now? Well, what's different now is basically that any 15-year-old kid with a smartphone and access to the internet can immediately download the wallet software and start exchanging Bitcoin. So it makes it just a lot more easy for this currency competition to occur. So on the one hand, you could say that this is a good idea, a good thing, because it keeps central bankers honest, if you like. But on the other hand, it may impose an undesirable constraint on bankers that are responsible but have to compete with this ridiculous object that's kind of siphoning or redirecting resources. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. There's a long history of private monies. I mean, you can go to Google this, private monies in the United States. You know, the most famous one is the Ithaca Hour in Ithaca, New York. I mean, there's hundreds of them around the world, in fact. And so I see nothing new here in terms of like these cryptocurrencies are likely, I don't think they're going away. I think they're going to likely coexist. I think specific cryptocurrencies are going to serve particular niche markets. I don't think they're going to displace any major currency like the US dollar or the euro. And then finally, to segue into my final subject is central bank digital currency. Some people ask whether central banks should issue cryptocurrencies based on blockchain technology. And what I would like to do right now is just to squash that idea. Just if you have to go through my slides, and if you understand one thing, you'll understand that to operate a blockchain is necessary only when you don't trust the record keeper. Central banks, you're either going to trust the central bank or you don't trust the central bank. If you trust the central bank, you don't need blockchain. You can just, a conventional database management system is much more efficient. And like, why would you want to trust the central bank, right? I always ask, why do you think the Fed would steal money from your account? How many people think that the Fed would steal money from your account? Of course not. Why not? Not enough? It's what? No. There's not enough. That's funny. Now, suppose there was a lot. No, we wouldn't steal any money from your account because the Fed can create all the money it wants. It doesn't have to steal your money. That was a joke. Okay. Joke doesn't, okay. Okay, so my final subject is central bank digital currency. Now, what am I talking about here, about central bank digital currency, if I'm not talking about blockchain? Well, we know we already have digital deposit money, right? Most of the money that's in existence is actually already digital. The private banking sector creates it. Your checking account is a digital money, digital currency. And of course, private banks have access to digital reserves. The reserve accounts they hold with the Federal Reserve are electronic. There's no, the reserves are primarily electronic. So to me, central bank digital currency simply means universal access to central bank accounts. So it has nothing to do with blockchain per se, but it has to do with making who gets access to the central bank's balance sheet. Who gets access to the central bank balance sheet today in the United States? Well, actually, everybody in the world has access to the paper component of the Fed's balance sheet. The one component of the liabilities of the Federal Reserve are in the form of cash, paper notes, the US dollar. And anybody in the world is allowed to hold an account with the Fed in the form of a paper dollar. What about the electronic reserves? Who gets access to that? Well, only the banks do. So only a select few of institutions in the United States, the depository institutions, have access to the electronic component of the Fed's balance sheet. The rest of us have access to the paper. So when I talk about central bank digital currency, I like to think of combining FedWire with Treasury Direct, just kind of conceptually, not literally, but something like that. What is FedWire? I already described FedWire. It's a real-time gross settlement system. It's very, very efficient. It makes payments instantaneous across parties. And Treasury Direct, what is that? Well, just go and click on the site there. I don't know how many of you know this, but every U.S. person is permitted to open up an online account with the U.S. Treasury and start buying and selling U.S. Treasury bonds. They're basically electronic interest-bearing accounts. Everybody can open up an account. These accounts are not set up to make payments, but that's a policy choice. What happens if we combine the payments technology with the universal access to the government account? What happens if we combine the two? I'm going to call that central bank digital currency. Is that a good idea? Why would you want to do that? And here, Julie and I this is where Julie and I part ways. Well, I go, why not? I don't know, let me throw it to you out like this. In the United States today, we have a highly efficient real-time gross settlement system. Payments occur instantaneously. These accounts are fully insured. You could have $1 trillion in these accounts, and they would be completely insured. The Federal Reserve doesn't default because it can print the money. So completely, fully insured accounts, no limits. It costs practically nothing to make payments, these instantaneous payments that are fully insured. And the Fed pays you 2.4% on the deposits in this account. 2.4%. Ask how much you're making on your deposit account at your bank. If there's bankers in the room, I apologize. How much are you charging? How much are you paying your customers? Who gets access to this wonderful service in the United States? Answer? Almost nobody. Only the big banks get access. The depository, they're all big as far as I'm concerned. When I measure them compared to my, all depository institutions in the United States have access to it. For you and me and everybody else, we have to go through the banking system, and at least presently, although I think things are going to be changing, so this is a place we want to keep an eye on. But for the most part, up until now, most of us have to make do with a relatively slow payment system that works with this ACH architecture. Payments clear in 2 to 3 business days, maybe longer, so it takes some time to clear payments. These accounts are insured by FDIC, but only, I say only, by $250,000. But for a big firm, with cash management issues, they're not going to deposit their money in the bank. They're going to go to the shadow banking sector, where it's safer, or supposedly safer. And for small businesses in particular that are operating on thin margins, there's these interchange fees that have to be paid. It's kind of expensive for a firm to use this payment system. And at the same time, these accounts basically yield 0%. So, and this is for the bank population. There's also a significant number of people who are not even banked in the United States. Almost 10 million households don't even have bank accounts. And so I argue this makes no sense. There may be multiple solutions to this problem, but I think central bank digital currency is one of them. Here's a plot of some interest rates. The blue line here is the Fed's interest on reserve, or policy rate. You see in December of 2015, after many years of paying almost no interest, the Federal Reserve raised its policy rate, and today it's at 2.4%. This is the interest rate that we pay banks for holding accounts, reserve accounts with the Fed. And you see at the same time, these are the lending rates that banks have been charging. You see lending rates have been going up, but the deposit rates basically remain pretty low, kind of flat line. So, if you take a look at kind of the spreads here, you're talking over 600 basis points. I know there's risk considerations to take into account here, but still 600 basis points. That's a pretty big gap. So that's some evidence of kind of the oligopolistic structure of the US banking sector. This central bank digital currency, I don't view it as directly competing with banks as in a full service sort of capacity. What I'm thinking of here is a public utility option. It's just a facility that's designed to provide very basic banking payment services. It's not a credit facility. And it's just a public option to give people an option to go there if they want. So no fees or minimum balances. They'd be fully insured, at least FDIC. No, fully insured, in fact. You don't even need FDIC for accounts at the Fed. Sorry, excuse me. So they'd be fully insured. They'd pay higher interest rate, possibly the interest on reserve rate, possibly less. There'd be no interchange fees for debit card payments. Payments between Fed accounts would clear in real time. Imagine you're making payments, your lawn service company comes from Seattle, comes here, they mow your lawn, and you just pay them instantaneously with your debit card drawn in your mutual Fed bank accounts. Clears instantly at no cost, instantaneously. How simple could that be for everyone in America to make payments to each other in such a simple and cheap manner? And there'd be no overdraft privileges. I'm going to say, who's in charge of my time here?
Me.
Yeah. How much time do I have?
None.
Oh. Well, thanks for the countdown, Julie. I think I have about 3 slides left. So the question is whether we eat into the
Q&A?
Q&A a little bit. So if you'll forgive me, I will go very quickly on what's remaining here because I just don't want to skip over it. So, but I'll give you the executive summary here and go very, very quickly. What are the economic consequences of introducing a central bank digital currency? The basic answer to that question is nobody really knows for sure because we haven't really introduced one. There's really no real-world experiments. Although I would say that if we wanted to look to history, what's very interesting is the United States had a postal savings system that kind of looks like an old-style version of what I'm advocating here. U.S. postal system was implemented after the Panic of 1907. That was when, remember, depositors didn't have insurance, so a lot of people lost their money in the panic. And in fact, that was the panic that motivated the establishment of the Federal Reserve in the first place in 1913. And this postal savings system was very, very attractive to working class Americans because the post office was everywhere. So the ubiquitous locations, and the accounts were government insured. So it was very attractive way, just basic utility banking. And the system basically, it peaked in 1933. It had about 10 to 20% of deposits. And then basically when FDR introduced FDIC in 1933, I think, basically the system went out. I have a paper that you can link up here that kind of tries to investigate this question more analytically. And I have a model that I thought ambitiously I would give to you because I was at a university. But at the end of the day, I think what I'll do is I'll just summarize the results of that analysis. That admittedly rests on some simplifying assumptions that I admit one could criticize. But the question is rather how sensitive my conclusions are to those assumptions. Okay, result 1, I find that the introduction of this facility theoretically should have no impact on the lending arm of the banking industry. It should in no way impact lending operations because at least in theory, in this simplified model, the opportunity cost of lending funds is the interest on reserve rates, not the central bank digital currency rate, which is going to be set slightly below. So any fears of crowding out lending in this model are kind of not right. In the model, what happens, it's true that the central bank digital currency adds added competition for deposits, but in the model, at least what happens is that the banks are motivated to match the government's rate in order to retain deposits with the bank. And so in this sense, what the introduction of this facility does is basically compel banks to become more competitive in their deposit rates. And the effect of this is, in fact, to increase the depositor base and reduce the demand for cash. So in fact, this has the effect of increasing financial inclusion in the model because it makes deposits more attractive than cash. And in terms of financial stability or instability, and there are no implications. So I think, let me conclude here. This is my last slide. Blockchain is just a database management system. Its distinguishing characteristic is record keeping that's performed communally instead of being delegated to a trusted third party. So it's nothing mysterious. There's nothing fancy. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's just another type of database management system. The useful applications to this point appear limited, but who knows what the future holds. Cryptocurrencies are just an application of the blockchain idea. They're best viewed by central banks as foreign currencies. I think they're not going to go away. They're likely to serve various niche markets. And finally, central bank digital currency means universal access to central bank accounts. But these accounts are going to be processed by conventional, what I argue is more efficient database management system, the one we have in place now. And that the fears of the introduction of this facility are largely overblown, I think. And I think we have to think seriously. If not this solution, something similar. I think that having 10 million households that are underserved, underbanked in this country, or small businesses that have to pay high interchange fees, at the same time the banks get like 2.4% in free payment service, basically. This is not good politically. The political optics are terrible. So if not CBDC, something else. I mean, I think something has to be done to level the playing field. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, I'm aware some students may need to leave, and that's fine. Please feel free to do so. But I have to do a few corrections here, David. By the way, it got better from the last time we did this, so I think I've had some effect. So a few things, just to give a little context, especially for our students who may not be as familiar with some of the operations of a central bank. So first of all, interest on reserves. Yes, the Federal Reserve holds accounts, or banks hold accounts with the Federal Reserve, and they are paid interest on reserves. It is a monetary policy tool. So I could see that you would say, well, that's the optics look wrong, and we probably could say that maybe, especially in this environment, it does, but it's there for monetary policy reasons. Back in the day, actually about the time of the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve did not use interest on excess reserves. So one could argue we could go back to that day, and then we have some issues with your theory there. So just kind of suggesting that what exists today may not be in the future. But I also want to give you a little bit of insight into this idea of not a central bank digital currency, because you've essentially said that's not really what we need. What we really need is for people to have access to the Federal Reserve to clear and settle transactions, and that's equivalent to a central bank digital currency. Got that right? Yeah. So today, when a bank comes to the Federal Reserve, I know we have bankers in the room, you're like, it's not exactly quite like that. What the Federal Reserve does is, first of all, make sure that it's legal. And in the case of the Federal Reserve Act, the requirement is that the financial institution have federal deposit insurance or be eligible for federal deposit insurance. We have a legal issue immediately. But also what we do for our financial institutions is we do a financial evaluation of you. We look at your financial health. Because even though it said in your slide that there would be no need for overdrafts or credit, intraday there is a credit need. Someone has to go first to move financial transactions because they don't all occur at the same point in time. So part of what we do at the Federal Reserve is we provide financial institutions with intraday credit. And the way we do that, subject to a lot of calculations and criteria, is we take collateral. So what are you going to pledge to me for your account at the Federal Reserve? And that gets into what I would say some of the practical issues associated with it.
Can you maybe elaborate on what real time means then? Because to me, real time means that there's an instantaneous debit and credit of accounts. So where is the necessity of the collateral?
Right, so the credit may occur, but the transaction that's covering that particular payment may not have come in from the other counterparty, not party to this transaction. So you have multiple transactions occurring, not just...
I don't know. I'm thinking of peer-to-peer transactions, debiting, crediting accounts. This is not rocket science. I understand that what I take very seriously Julie's comments, by the way, but in principle, this is just accounting, debiting, crediting accounts. Yeah. And of course, you have to be careful of the details, the legalities, but a lot of this is policy design. You're right, there might be legal ramifications right now, but if we're serious, we can lobby for changes in these policies.
Yeah. So we'll disagree on that one. Okay. Let's go a little bit to broadly virtual currency. So one of the things I think Dave did a really good job of is distinguish between the ledger and the currency. Sometimes when I hear people talk about Bitcoin, it's a mash, it's a mashup. And it's not clear whether you're talking about that transaction that is occurring to represent an exchange or you're talking about the accounting ledger. So thank you for doing that. But remember, there are many kinds of distributed ledgers. Blockchain is only one. So as we think about that from a central bank standpoint, what we do is we say, well, how would this distributed ledger work? And it's not clear it would be an open ledger. It would probably be a permissioned ledger. So the BB&T folks would have permission to clear and settle a transaction with the stockyards folks. You would be party to that. You two get to say, yep, we agree that transaction occurred. Probably that's the way it worked. And so we've experimented in the Federal Reserve to say, but would it be fast enough? Could we really do it? And the answer is not yet.
Yeah,
Technology is not fast enough for a permission system. So go ahead with the Bitcoin and the open ledgers and that, but probably not going to see it in a central bank anytime soon. A couple other things that I'll just mention is, as we think about payments in the Federal Reserve, and you alluded to it, we're moving very quickly to faster payments. So you do have delays in current payment transactions, but it's already occurring for some banks that have adopted real-time payment systems, and for others, they probably will. So this lag thing that occurs in today's payments, the 2 days or 3 days, we expect within a few years that will be erased. So then when you look at your account, right, because probably you don't know what, if I say check register, you don't know what I'm saying. When you, no, you don't know. When you look at your account, you are really going to see what's there versus what happens today where there's some delays and you get very frustrated and you get an overdraft. A couple of other things that I would offer for the benefit of the group. So first of all, access to accounts. I challenge you, Dave. I think everyone has access to bank accounts today. I think the bankers would agree. They actually work very hard to open access. Some of the challenges with bank accounts, there's some things in there in addition to access, and that has to do with some people don't want to be found in the financial system. They do not want to be known. And that's not something a bank can fix. If I have some sort of payment that I need to make and I'm not making it, I don't want a bank account to be able to garnish that account. So that's a challenge. Also, in the work we've done in my area, there are some cultural challenges. There are some cultures in the United States that just because of countries and other experiences don't want to have a bank account. Now, the good news is the US has come up with many other sorts of things like stored prepaid cards or otherwise payments, payroll payments to cards, those sorts of things that are actually really bank accounts somewhere, but they sure don't look like it to the individual. And I do think technology will continue to chip away at that to the extent someone wants to be banked.
I agree with that. One thing I would say is the United States is a little bit of an outlier, I think. Like if you compare to US to Canada, there's only 3% or something of households in Canada are not banked. And the question is, an important research question is why? And also, I'd like you to address, I agree with everything you say. I think there's this innovation that's going on. And by the way, I think permitting fintech to have master accounts at the Fed would be a great way to promote.
Oh, we need to talk about that. We just talked about that earlier today.
I wanted to ask you the question, what about the interchange fees, for small businesses that are struggling to survive? Competition in the banking sector, what do you see?
Okay, so I know we have some bankers in the room. I'm going to give you my take on interchange fees. So here's basically every time you guys are swiping, someone's paying for that. Well, back in the day of checking accounts, what used to happen is you paid for your account. You paid for every check you wrote or you paid for an account balance. When we went to the swipes, really I think probably more as a means to gain acceptance, that moved to the merchant. So the incentive structure, probably for the right, the philosophy is probably right, but the outcome resulted in the merchants carrying the cost. Now, the banks did other things. They subsidized checking accounts. I think that was probably the big one with those fees, much as, say, in credit cards. You get promotions like dollars back or miles. So the system isn't necessarily that straightforward, but I think the argument is that the system itself was structured probably to create incentives to begin with, but it actually put the burden on the wrong party, and the wrong party should have been the user of the card. Would the bankers agree with that pretty much? Yeah. So back to this, yeah, but there's a reason it's there, and that cost is going to have to get picked up somewhere. Logically, it should be moved to the user of the transaction, not the merchant. So a couple of other things I wanted to mention, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we were talking earlier today about person-to-person payment systems. So you guys are using those, right? So Venmo users, raise your hands.
Wow.
Just every student. Zelle?
Wow.
These are all the bankers. I knew it. I just knew it. Okay, where am I? Apple Pay? Just me? Oh, yes. Thank you very much. And there are a few other systems out there. Do you know what you're using? Not really, right?
Essentially a prepaid account.
Yeah. Okay, Zelle is not a bank account.
Well, I thought you meant Apple Pay.
Oh, Apple Pay. Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. So first of all, Zelle. Until you move those balances in your bank account, you do not have balances in a bank account. Now, if you're okay with that, that's fine. But just realize some of the things you talked about, like guarantee insurance and all those things, they don't apply. So just understand it and then go fine with it. Zelle is a bank product. So it's a little bit different. It might not be as social. Venmo and Zelle. It might not be as social as Venmo, but it is a very different product in that it's a bank-run product. Now, Apple Pay is yet another product. It's not a bank product, but they do something different in that as you make those payments, particularly the payments to merchants, but any payment you make, it is tokenized. I can't see who you are paying, and you are the owner of the information, not the financial institution. So if you care about your privacy, then you will like that. Now, I don't think any of these financial institutions will misuse your information, so don't get me wrong, but just realize you are giving data away in many of these services that is being aggregated and stored somewhere, and as long as you're okay with that, it's fine with me. But understand the products you're using. The great news is that there are many articles out there. Even Consumer Reports is now doing assessments of some of these features. And as students, I really encourage you to go out and look at them so you understand the products you're using. Okay, I had one more point to make, and then we will turn it over for questions. How many digital currencies exist today? We talked about Bitcoin. How many digital currencies exist?
Upwards of 2,000.
Bingo. Are you an economics major or
Vice
finance?
President of the Blockchain Club.
Never mind. Okay, spot on. Upwards of 2,000. So I think that gives you a good sense of how experimental this whole area is. And what's key, and David, you didn't talk about this, is when you look at Bitcoin, what's it being used for?
Do you want all the answers?
Well, just substantively, not 100.
Well, originally it was mostly for drugs, but I personally use it for hosting, web hosting. I can send transactions for it. Social media followers, I'll buy it out from somebody in India in about 15 minutes. They'll deliver them to me. So it's easy for international transactions, so my friends do.
Yeah, so you're actually using it for a purpose. Are you paying for your Starbucks there?
Well, I could, but I only drink water.
You only drink water. Well, and you'd have to find a place that took it.
Yeah, that's true.
Here's the thing. Most merchants, some do, but most merchants don't take Bitcoin. So you really only have a limited purpose utility
ordered
here.
pizza on Baxter Avenue.
Well, okay, I said a few. Man, holy gosh, this is a hard. Okay, here's the thing though. Here's what I got involved. Why didn't do it? So I got a scareware email about 3 months ago. You know what a scareware email is?
Oh yeah, those are tough.
Yeah, it said I had been visiting a pornography site, that this person had activated the camera on my computer, and that they were going to release it publicly if I didn't pay, I don't know, $50 in Bitcoin or something. And so, of course, what did I do? I sent it to our IT folks saying, I'm being scammed. Would you deal with this? But how many people? But I don't go visit pornography sites, but thousands do, thousands. And I think that's the other challenge we have right now, is the integrity of some of these coins is suspicious. Now, one thing I will tell you is when you bought that coin, you went in through an exchange, probably Coinbase maybe?
Well, actually, I bought it from a friend, but yes,
Okay.
Coinbase is a good one
Okay,
as well.
okay. So the one thing they are required to do is to conduct anti-money laundering. So even though within that coin itself, some unsavory things might be occurring, as that coin goes in and out, those transactions are being monitored and reports are being filed with FinCEN. So there is a little bit of check and balance. But I give you all that to say this is still an experimental space. So it's fun, it's cool. Some people are making money betting. My son did. That was bad. But I would be a little bit cautious about thinking it's going to be the currency of the future. It's just too soon to know. So now you have his perspective. Now you have my perspective. Let's see what questions you have for us.
for your remarks. What are the consequences, both positive and negative, for individuals who do not have Bitcoin?
For individuals who do not have Bitcoin, you're losing out on all the fun when you're making the money and all of the pain when you're losing the money.
I would agree with Dave on that one. I know he said it. So it's fine if that's something you want to do. I'm not sure that there's a good reason to use virtual currencies. If I were in a country where I had a very unstable currency, I might think differently. But in the US where we have a very stable currency, I'm not sure. I'm convinced that there is a good reason, and I have never purchased a Bitcoin.
Full disclosure, I come from like a regulatory interest, not an economic theory interest, so.
Yes.
The most intriguing thing I saw on those slides was your statement saying central bank cryptocurrencies based on blockchain technology literally makes no sense. I agree with that, and I've kind of been racking my brain for the past few weeks with JP Morgan coin, trying to figure out, was that just a couple of older folks and a misnomer? Is that them trying to activate one of these central bank digital currencies, or what is your take, potentially both of your takes, on like what that really is and like is characterized as?
Yeah, to the best of my understanding, it's just a regular kind of deposit account. I think a lot of these, there's a lot of these products that these established institutions, early on devoted resources to these cryptocurrency groups, to kind of see whether or not there might be some potential application. And then they come up sometimes with kind of innovative ideas, which to me are just innovations in regular database management that happen all the time. But because these funds were allocated to, cryptocurrency projects, the child that was born out of these activities were given the label cryptocurrency or blockchain. But it's just a marketing, I believe it's just a marketing tool, and a clever one at that, because it sounds sexy. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's just regular fintech. It's just nothing, it has nothing to do with communal consensus record keeping. This is what I defined as the distinguishing or defining characteristic of blockchain. There's no way financial institutions are going to open up and let the crowds manage their books. I think it's insane. So why call it that? Well, marketing.
So I'm not familiar with that one specifically, but it is really important to understand what we'll call it coin for right now is. Actually, sometimes they're closer to commodities, sometimes they're closer to securities, sometimes they're nothing in between. So understanding what you have is important. But I think it is fair to say, again, there's 2,000 of these out there. There's every variation on the theme, and not so clear that the true cryptos have a good solid place yet. We may see that in the future, but for right now, it looks like it's a lot of fun.
Good afternoon, good evening. How is everything you talked about this afternoon apply to other business aspects?
Of the blockchain technology, you mean?
Yes.
So I spoke a little bit about what, I had a slide that said, what are the potential benefits of blockchain in general? So a database management system, database management isn't just about managing money accounts, it's managing information. It's a big problem, I guess, in pharmaceutical industry, for example, people counterfeiting pharmaceuticals, for example, keeping track of where these pharmaceuticals are in the chain, as they're being delivered across various ports of entry. So database management is just a hugely important, accounting is very important, as I said in my opening, how to account for whether a product is the real thing or counterfeited. So potentially the blockchain has applications to almost anything where either a centralized database manager is either not available or not trusted. So potentially there's applications in all sorts of businesses.
I would add, though, where I think we're seeing the most experimentation in the banking industry right now is in the area of artificial intelligence. So the blockchain experiments continue to say, can we settle securities transactions, for example, settle a contract? But the question of can we use artificial intelligence, which I define to be all its components. So that would include machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing. We see new experimentation going on there. So some of the use cases are, for example, are we able to look at patterns of behavior of our customers to determine whether there are services we can recommend for them, since these services are spread across the entity? Or sometimes being used for things like, can we see patterns of behavior in our employees that might alert us to activities that would be occurring that maybe we as an organization don't want and pose reputation risk? So I think that's really, really intriguing of, well, what's the potential there? The data, the opportunity is huge with the continued movement to the cloud environment. The ability to bring this data together in ways that haven't been there before is very significant. So more to come on that, but I suspect the next time we're here, we'll be talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Thank you for coming to,
Robotic processing, yep.
Thank you for coming to speak today. One question regarding your point about this federal bank account being able to regulate their interest rates to keep other banks competitive. Yeah. Since the federal government tends to serve as a system of checks and balances on a lot of our smaller industries, what would be the system of checks and balances to stop the federal government from essentially using their ability to manipulate their interest rate to encourage more civilian expenditure into their banks at a time of crisis for the country, thus shutting down those other banks?
Let's see. So you're thinking during a financial crisis? What
I mean, there's, based upon like the recent events and recent government changes, there's definitely a significant amount of distrust in the government as well as distrust of where our money is allocated. If this bank is used as a typical bank, that would mean the government would have access to those funds to use to produce money for themselves as well as ensure that they can make loans and things like that. So my question is, what would stop the federal government, what would be the regulatory body for the federal government so that they couldn't make their interest rates so delectable that it would cause other banks to not be able to retain customers?
Oh, I see. So you're concerned that the Federal Reserve, given its powers, monopoly control over the reserves, could potentially outcompete all these banks.
Yeah, and I know that goes like against the point that you made about like there shouldn't be any fear with respect to it, but I don't think it's an unfair question or an unfair thought that in the distant future that could take place, since there's no regulatory body for this theoretical bank.
Well, I mean, you're asking, I think, a very complicated and relevant question about governance structures. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is. At the end of the day, you hope that our elected representatives will enact regulations and rules and protocols that end up in the best, with the best design in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. I don't know. At the end of the day, I mean, if you don't trust your elected officials to do that, I mean, we're in a sad state of affairs. I don't know what to say. So, David,
A couple of thoughts on that. I think we need to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve absent this issue. When Congress designed the Federal Reserve, it was done, actually, I think, really thoughtfully. Any central bank that's survived over 100 years is frankly amazing. But it was done with this intentional balance of power. So you have the Board of Governors in Washington. That's, if it's full, 7 members. They are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And then you have the other 12. And the 12 are the Federal Reserve Bank presidents. They all sit on the Federal Open Market Committee. And at any point in time, 5 of those presidents always vote. So 7 governors, 5 presidents, if everything is perfect. The other thing that Congress did that's a little odd today, we sure talk about it a lot, is it structured it so that those governors, those folks in Washington, that's the political part, they would have 14-year terms. The idea was that no one president would ever then appoint a majority of the Board of Governors. Now that's kind of not worked out that way if you've been following the Fed lately. Just because people leave early, they don't stay 14 years. The current president has appointed, there's currently 5 governors, the current president has appointed 4 of those 5 governors, and there's 2 open seats. But remember that balance of power, the Federal Reserve Bank presidents. I think that has served the country well. It's not perfect, guys. On any given day, you could say, that feels a little too political. But when you hear that the Fed is under fire from members of Congress or the president, that's because of that independence. And that's what I want to give back to you. I think that independence has served the economy well, and I think it's served the country well. But it's certainly not without its folks who say the Fed is too independent. And I hope it gives you calm that silly thing you wanted to do ever occurred, that you've got an independent structure that, as much as we can, has separated itself from politics.
Right, and I think I want to add to that, to further my point, is we're independent, but that does not mean that we're not accountable
Correct.
to the government. Congress created the Fed. We are a creature of Congress. Congress consists of your elected representatives, so we are doing the will of the people. Congress has afforded the Fed varying degrees of independence on how to conduct monetary policy, but Congress has also mandated our goals, our objectives. We have an inflation mandate, we have full employment mandate. So the Fed is not independent of Congress in that sense. I mean, Congress can basically tell us what to do. And I think that's how it should be, because the Fed does not consist of elected officials. We're technocrats. Congress consists of the elected representatives. So you got to hope that your elected representatives design these rules wisely. And in the case of central bank digital currency, with input from people like Julie and academics, I mean, I think you could design something that would satisfy your concerns about the misuse of the facility for whatever. Americans, if there's one thing Americans are great at, is instituting systems of checks and balances, I think. So I'd be
Yeah. And an important point here, just to be sure we didn't lose it for you, is we are accountable to Congress. We're just not accountable to an administration. And there's a big difference between the two. The other thing I would offer, some will say, well, why is the Fed's balance sheet so large? And now the Fed has said in September it's going to stop reducing the size of its balance sheet. So yes, there's all of these banks that hold accounts at the Fed, and they're earning whatever the Fed sets as the rate of interest on excess reserves. When you start to tear apart what the Fed's balance sheet is, it's a good chunk. There are three things that have driven the growth in the balance sheet. One was quantitative easing, when the Fed stepped in and supported the economy by pushing really more reserves into the financial system. But as times have improved, some things have changed. And one of the big changes that has occurred is the nation's largest banking organizations are now required to hold what we call liquidity, meaning the ability to pay off deposits really fast, much more on their balance sheets. And they are holding most of those high-quality liquid assets in the form of Federal Reserve balances. Now, they could hold Treasury securities. That would be an option. But they have to hold something considered a high-quality liquid asset. So that's a big chunk of the continued size of our balance sheet. Certainly, cash balances have grown over time. Treasury balances have grown over time. But it's not just as if, it's willy-nilly and banks are holding it because that's the best earning asset they can get. It's not. In fact, if banks paid interest on excess reserves, your loan rates would go way up.
Question for both of you all. You previously mentioned credit scores, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on currencies like MakerDAO that offered loan services for people that didn't have a traditional credit score, and if that had a future possibly for those that are unbanked. And for you, before I became a consultant, I didn't believe in blue skies laws, but after doing it, I see why you have them. Will you consider putting cryptocurrencies outside of the 1933 Securities Act, or into a different class, since they didn't have the internet back then?
So the first question was
Basically, taking out the banks out of the financial market.
It
making
sounds
it
like a fintech,
Yes.
some sort of business designed to extend
Yes.
credit to people
And we
who are
have those
underserved.
today in fintechs.
Yeah, to me, that's just regular financial innovation in the
Yeah.
space. I don't think, no, Bitcoin is not a credit facility. Bitcoin is just a payment service. I mean, when you extend credit, I don't think there's anything really in these innovations. I might be speaking too strongly here, but credit is a different creature. I mean, credit actually, comes from the Latin or Italian word credere, which means to believe that your debtors will repay you. And so it's based on trust. And I don't see how Bitcoin and blockchain circumvents this need for trust in credit markets. It's good for like peer-to-peer payments when you have the money available. But how does Bitcoin, for example, how do you enforce, suppose I lend you some Bitcoin or something through this facility, what enforces the repayment of how is the blockchain going to help me get my money back?
Oh, well, they do it on Ethereum, and they start you out with increments, like you'll do $15 microloans up into a larger amount.
Regular banks have been
Yeah.
doing this for hundreds
Well,
of
they
years.
also,
Can I speak to that a little bit?
Yeah.
I want to get to your other one on, will they be considered a security or a commodity or something special? Can they be, and that's up to the regulator, that's not up to the Fed. So the CFTC and the SEC will look at each of those, and what they've told us to date, and we have talked to them, is if it meets the definition of security, it will be treated as a security. If it meets the definition of a commodity, it will be treated as a commodity. If it meets neither, then it won't, but that's kind of up to them. So on the lending side of this, this is growing very, very quickly on financial technology being used for lending. Sometimes it's independent lending club. Sometimes it's tied to a business, Square. And what we see happening very quickly is that the very traditional data for consumer lending, credit score, is now being added, supplanted or complemented with other things. So I'll give you a specific example, Square. So Square got into the business for payments. They wanted to reduce those fees. Jim McKelvey was a student at Washington University in St. Louis, a glass blower, lost a sale of a piece of glass he had blown because this business he started, Third Degree Glass Factory, did not take credit cards. So he was upset. So he and a guy he knew named Jack Dorsey got together with another guy, and they built Square. And it was a payments product to create a lower cost payments. Well, guess what happened? They started collecting all this data on cash flow from small businesses, because small businesses have flocked to Square. And guess what they're doing now?
selling it?
Lending.
Ah.
Lending. And it's elegant because what they're able to do with their merchants is say, I see your pattern of cash flows, so I will make this credit available, and then your repayment will come back from your future cash flows. Very, very low credit risk
But notice,
associated with it.
everything she's described is using conventional technology. It has
It's
nothing to do with
conventional.
blockchain.
This is conventional. This is actually algorithms. So this is artificial intelligence and machine learning. We see this going on all over the place, and the bankers will come to me sometimes and say, but why did they do it? I had a small business. I could have supported them, and they went to Lending Club, and they paid, fill in the amount, and I could have helped them. So there's a real interesting, change occurring where the internet and the power of those tools, the ability to sit down at your desk day or night, because small businesses, it's usually night, and get access to credit, seemingly is more attractive than going to the traditional bank to get it, and it makes at a lower rate. So what's going to happen? I think the banks are going to catch up.
Great. I want to thank you guys. Wonderful talk, and I really appreciate it. So we thank them.